Ольга, мы как и договаривались, тогда в 10:55 мы всех начинаем запускать и заставку с музыкой.
Да, отлично.
Хорошо.
Денис, еще раз сейчас вот присоединится Лена. Она, я еще не вижу, но она, естественно, присоединится. Вы ей еще раз скажите, что нужно сказать в начале, потому что она
Ну,
открывает.
смотрите, если Елена до 10:05, ну, короче, если за 5 минут до конца она не присоединяется, сейчас в общем эфире я это говорить не буду. Пишите в чат ей, потому что это будут слышать все тогда.
Все понятно. Так, сейчас я поняла, где мой
Ну, просто сказать, что кнопка перевод и все. Тут что, тут все понятно.
А это я сейчас пишу в чате, чтобы все это видели. Для функции синхронного перевода пользуйтесь иконкой Interpretation. То есть я сразу будет висеть инструкция, чтобы на это время не тратить или кто-то не увидит.
Хорошо,
Всё, хорошо.
спасибо.
Коллеги выступающие, добрый день. Проверьте, пожалуйста, на всякий случай, сейчас можете ли вы
Morning,
включить
colleagues. Could you please check that you can turn on and off
Да,
your mic?
включил.
My mic is on. Now it's off. Everything works fine.
Все супер, спасибо большое.
Great, thank you.
Коллеги, добрый день. Мы всех сейчас пускаем, мы убираем комнату
Morning,
ожидания.
colleagues. I'm going to let all the participants in from the waiting room.
Друзья, коллеги, доброе утро. Я рада вас всех приветствовать на
Good
нашем
morning, colleagues. Welcome to our event. Today we're going to speak about central banks and their role in climate regulation in CIS countries. Right, this is the last Russian chapter event in 2020. 2020 has been quite a challenging year, a lot of problems, a lot of concerns, reasons for anxiety, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknowns, but the year was also plenty of resources, and the year offered us a lot of opportunities, a lot of experience. We met new people, we launched new projects, and the challenges that we faced, that we continue to face, I think to a large extent will enrich our experience and maybe show us ways and possibilities for developing businesses, for developing ourselves as people, as professionals. And summing up this year, I'd like to say thank you to 2020, and maybe it's time to say goodbye and transition to a more stable period. We're happy to see you here. For the Russian chapter, the year was, I'd say, rather good, because we were able to present our platform, we launched our platform, we raised awareness about ourselves, and we met a lot of you, we cooperated with a lot of you, and then there are people with whom we have worked together for a long time, both professionally and as friends. Maybe we will find new opportunities for presenting a new product to you, a new interesting agenda. We aim to develop further, develop our platform, enhance it, and enrich it with new tools, interesting tools. We have just launched it. We've had a few events so far. We launched in September 2020, and the launch was largely successful. We've had discussions, heated debates. We've invited a lot of interesting speakers and experts, and in light of that, I think this is a good start. We will keep offering ideas, new interesting approaches. We'll be opening new interesting discussions, and I hope that in the ESG and climate agenda context, our partners, the management, will see us as a source of good tools for tackling the ESG agenda. We will be willing to provide expert assessment, analytics. We are willing to work with regulators, and we've been inviting regulators regularly on our platform for them to be well equipped to understand what's going on at the level of all stakeholders. So we will continue doing that. And today we have a slightly unusual topic. We have tried to embrace the climate agenda more broadly, to approach it from the perspective of central banks, the regulators. We habitually see central banks as this centralized regulator, and sometimes moving ahead of the changes that the issuers yet have to go through. They support issuers through those changes, including through the corporate governance code. They provide different approaches and disclose the changes that are expected to happen 1 or 2 or 3 years from now. And we usually see central banks very actively involved in any new trend, in any change, be it small or big. The climate agenda, the sustainable development agenda, is no exception to that. So I expect a very interesting discussion today, a very interesting talk with our speakers, and I'd like to present our speakers. Together with Olga Pasko, we'll be moderating this session. We have today Maxim Morozov, the Central Bank of the Russian Federation, head of the Department for Financial Stability of the Bank of Russia. And we also have Mark Smith, Operational Director of Deloitte in CIS and Managing Partner in the Caspian region. Also, we welcome Tatiana Zavyalova, Senior Vice President for ESG, representing Sberbank of Russia. And Asel Nurhametova, the advisor of the Green Finance Center of Astana International Financial Center, Kazakhstan. And before we begin, I'd like to tell you that we continue cooperation with our partners. DLA Piper is our legal partner. Deloitte is another valuable partner of ours, our informational intellectual partner. PBN Hills is our informational partner. And we are very happy to present our general partner, Sberbank, Sber, the company that has been supporting us from day one. And today we can finally say that they are our general partner, and we're very happy about it. We also work with the Independent Directors Club of Skolkovo, which also supports us in many ways. So with this, we can begin. Just a couple of words, just a couple of housekeeping remarks. We are recording this session, and after the session, we will provide you all the materials that we will be discussing. Olga, over to you, and we begin. Thank you very much, Yelena. Once again, very much welcome to our final event this year. This session will be dedicated to the role of central banks in managing the climate agenda and the integration of climate risks in financial stability. But before we begin, before we embark on our discussion on the financial system of Russia and CIS, I'd like to first provide a global perspective and say a couple of words on the initiative of central banks in ensuring a green financial system. The Network for Greening the Financial System, as it's called. It's usually called NGFS for short. It includes almost 87 central banks and financial supervisory agencies that focus on green financing, which is the goal of that initiative, and also to issue recommendations about the roles of central banks and the tools for mitigating climate risks. GFS was created not that long ago, in 2017, and its secretariat is currently in the Bank of France. Its chairman of the board is the head of the Central Bank of the Netherlands. The initiative was launched with 8 central banks, by 8 central banks under the management of the Bank of France, the Central Bank of the Netherlands, and the Bank of England. Central Bank of Russia joined this initiative. It was the first central bank out of the former USSR countries that joined this initiative in 2019. And in 2020, the Central Bank of Armenia and the Bank of Georgia also joined the platform. This week, we saw a landmark event. The Federal Reserve System of the US finally officially joined the consortium of central banks, even though the US started participating in various discussions more than a year ago. Why is that so important? Because the biggest achievement of NGFS is creating the global consensus on managing financial risks related to climate. And now that the American regulator is part of the NGFS, it gives a very important, it sends a very important message in the market to all the participants of the financial system. It says that global community of regulators is ready for actual action. Also, not that long ago, NGFS published a report on progress in implementing the practice of sustainable and responsible investing. 26 central banks participated in it. They represent 51 countries. And overall, the surveys and the polls prove the increase of awareness among central banks about climate risks.
Конкретные действия пока весьма ограничены.
Even though concrete action is still somewhat limited. The main results of that survey are as follows. First, all central banks agree that climate change is a significant problem because of the potential threat for the economy and also because of the impact on financial and operational systems. Many, but not all, central banks plan to change their procedures for disclosing climate risks, registering climate risks. 2/3 of central banks consider various measures to adjust their systems to managing climate risks. But so far, the implementation of specific steps is still at a very early stage. Fourth, the main impetus for the central bank to take protection measures against climate risks that occur as a result of climate factors on their balance sheet is underway. Fifth is the main argument for specific action is transition to low carbon economy for the long term. And last but not least, all central banks agree that international coordination, international cooperation is absolutely essential and key to mitigating climate risks, which means that the central banks realize the importance of incorporating climate risks in its management metrics, but they're not yet completely ready to act. The main hindrance for action is probably the risks of financial disbalances, which is understandable. So, in essence, when central banks look at climate change, at that problem, they focus on three main aspects. First, the increasing risks for financial stability of the banking and insurance industries. Second, the impact of climate change on the growth of GDP and inflation, and consequently on the decisions of regulators in monetary policy. And third, the possible direct role of the central banks in mitigating the consequences of climate change through proper management of their books. And now I'd like to hear from the Central Bank of Russia, represented today by Maxim Morozov, the head of the Department for Financial Stability. Maxim, what is the perspective of the Central Bank of Russia on the role of the regulator in managing climate risks?
Спасибо большое. Очень важную тему вы затронули про международное сотрудничество. И соглашусь с вами, что работа по вопросам климатических рисков находится на международном уровне на достаточно ранней стадии, особенно в части интеграции климатических рисков в регулирование и надзор. Тем не менее, вопросы климата обсуждаются достаточно давно. И в последнее время виден рост интереса к этому вопросу как со стороны инвесторов, так и со стороны официальных органов правительства Центрального банка. Действительно, изменение климата является источником риска как для реального, так и для финансового сектора и способно оказать влияние на устойчивость финансовой системы в целом. Физические риски оказывают прямое влияние на реальный сектор на микро- и макроуровне, могут привести к реализации экономических агентов, рыночных кредитных операционных рисков, рисков ликвидности. Риски, возникающие при переходе экономики к низкому
operational risks.
потреблению углеводородного топлива также
Transitioning
оказывают
to
прямое
low carbon
влияние на
economy
доходы
could also
реального сектора
impact
и могут
the
влиять
income in the
на
real sector
финансовый
and
сектор.
could also
Следует
affect
отметить,
the financial
что
sector.
пандемия и введение карантинных мер,
The
с одной
pandemic
стороны, оказали
and
краткосрочный
quarantine measures,
положительный эффект
lockdowns,
на экологию благодаря
had a
снижению
somewhat
выбросов в
positive effect
атмосферу.
on the economy
Однако в
through
долгосрочной
the decrease of
перспективе
emissions
наблюдается
in the
отрицательный
atmosphere,
эффект,
but in the
поскольку
long-term perspective,
пандемия
we see
ввиду
an adverse
увеличения
effect because the
нагрузки
pandemic
на
increased
сектор и
led to
снижения
an increase
доходов
in
уменьшает потенциал компаний
credit
по
debt
финансированию
on the
перехода к
population, and
низкоуглеродной экономике.
decreases
В
the
этой связи
potential
регуляторам следует
for
быть
companies
еще более
to transition
бдительными к
to low carbon
потенциальным
economy.
рискам.
Therefore, regulators have to be
Скажу
even
про
more
международную работу,
aware
вот,
and
про
focus even
которую
more
вы
on
важно
climate risks.
затронули в своем выступлении, Ольга.
An important topic that
Действительно,
you
международным
touched upon in your
организациям
speech
пока
as
не
well,
удалось
Olga.
выработать
It's true that
единый
international
целостный подход к
organizations
анализу
haven't
влияния
yet
климатических
worked
рисков
out
на финансовый
a
сектор.
comprehensive
Нету пока
approach,
единых
a united
потенциальных
approach
требований к учету.
to
Тем не менее, за
tackling
последние
climate
годы
risks.
работа
There are
по
no
этим вопросам
unified macroprudential
активизировалась.
regulations,
Есть уже действительно
but over the
целый
last
ряд
year,
рекомендаций для
this
надзорных
activity
органов.
has also
Некоторые
gained
рекомендации
momentum. There are
предназначены для
recommendations
финансовых институтов.
from
Ключевыми площадками, как вы
supervisory
сказали,
bodies for
является
financial
сообщество
institutions as
центральных
well,
банков, надзорных органов по
the
повышению
community of central
экологичности
banks
финансовой
and
системы. И я бы
supervisory
еще
bodies
отметил роль Совета по
for
финансовой
increasing the
стабильности как
environment,
такого
the
кросс-секторального регулятора,
green
который
industry
смотрит на
is
климатические
one of the
риски.
key players.
Но вопросы также активно обсуждаются
But
и в
also,
профильных секторальных органах,
these
Базельском
issues have been
комитете,
discussed
Международной
on the
ассоциации
Basel
органов
Committee, the
страхового
International
надзора,
Association of
Международной организации комиссий по
Insurance
ценным. Во
Supervision
всех этих
of
организациях и
securities.
вовлечен в их
The Bank of
работу.
Russia is the
И,
representative
наверное,
in
я
all those
затрону
bodies
какие-то
and involved very much in their
основные итоги
activities.
работы этих органов. С
And
момента публикации
now I'd
своего
like to cover
первого
some
доклада в
key
прошлом
activities of
году
theirs. Since
NGFS
the
провел
report was
целый ряд
published last year,
исследований и
NGFS
опубликовал
has
доклады.
conducted
Во-первых,
a number of
первый очень значимый доклад был
surveys,
о
has done lots of research.
макроэкономических
One of
последствиях и
the
влиянии на
important reports
финансовую
was
стабильность
on
климатических
macroeconomic
изменений.
consequences
Это фундаментальное,
of
важен для
climate
фундаментального
change.
понимания каналов
This is
влияния.
important for
Также
fundamental understanding of
NGFS опубликовал
channels
доклад
of
о практиках
impact. Also,
финансовых
they published
институтов
a
по
report on the practices
дифференциации
of
рисков
financial
зеленых
institutions on
и
differentiating
коричневых финансовых активов.
the risks of
И
green and
проводился
brown
обзор
financial assets.
анализа
They've
экологического
also
риска
provided an
финансовыми
overview of the
институтами.
of the
Также
environmental
у
risk
NGFS есть ряд
among
рекомендаций.
financial
В частности,
institutions. They
одно
also
из
have a
них –
number of
это руководство
recommendations.
для
One of them
центральных
is
банков по
a
ответственному
guidance
инвестированию.
for central banks
Есть
on
руководство по
responsible
внедрению в
investing.
потенциальный надзор
There is
климатического и
also
экологического
a
риска.
paper on macroprudential
Наиболее
regulation
значимым
of
результатом работы NGFS,
climate
по
risk.
нашему мнению,
One of the main results of
является
their work,
разработка
in our
сценарного
opinion, is
анализа
developing
развития
a scenario
климатических
analysis
рисков и
of
руководства по
climate
его
risk development
проведению.
and a guidance
Это было все
on
опубликовано
its
в
performance.
2020 году. В
This has all been
сценариях
published
исследуется экономическое
in
влияние от
2020. The
изменения климата
scenarios
и проводимой
examine the
политики при различных
effects of climate
допущениях.
change
Документы в первую очередь
with
разработаны
various
для
assumptions.
центральных банков, но
The
могут быть
document is
использованы
primarily for
финансовыми
central banks, but it
институтами
can also be
и
used by
любыми
financial
другими
institutions
заинтересованными лицами
and
для
by
построения
any
моделей
other
изменения
interested
климата
parties
и их
to
влияния
build
на экономику.
models
У них
of climate
запущен
change
специальный
and
сайт, на
its
котором
effects on the
доступны
economy.
сценарии с количественными
They have a
параметрами,
site,
которые
a
позволяют
website
построить
with the
собственную модель.
quantitative metrics
Среди доступных
that allow us to build your
показателей
own model.
изменения температуры, рост
The
выбросов
metrics
углекислого
include
газа в
changes
атмосферу,
in
влияние
temperature,
проводимой политики в области
CO2
климата на
emissions,
темпы роста ВВП
policies
и
in
другие
climate
последствия.
change and their impact on
Об
GDP
использовании
and
сценариев
other
NGFS в
metrics.
стресс-тестировании финансового сектора,
The stress
как
testing of the financial
ожидалось,
sector,
заявили Банк Англии и Банк Франции, которые во многом
the
продвигают
NGFS,
работу
the
NGFS. Мы также в
Bank of
настоящее
England and the Bank
время
of France are
изучаем
actively promoting the work of
возможность
NGFS. We
интеграции этих
have
сценариев
been
в наши внутренние
looking
стресс-тесты.
into the possibility to
Скажу
integrate those
про Совет по
scenarios in our
финансовой
internal stress tests.
стабильности. В конце ноября
The
этого
Financial
года был
Stability Council.
опубликован доклад о влиянии
At the end of November
климатических
this year,
изменений на финансовую
they published
стабильность.
a report
В
on
документе
climate
исследуются
change and its
каналы
impact on financial
распространения
stability.
физических и
The
переходных
document
рисков в
explores the
финансовой
channels
системе
for
с фокусом на потенциальные
transitional
механизмы
risks and
усиления
climate
рисков
risks in
и
financial system
возможные
with a focus on
трансграничные
potential
эффекты. В дальнейшем
increase
Совет по
in risks
финансовой
and potential
стабильности планирует оценить доступность данных для
cross-border
мониторинга
impact.
климатических рисков для финансовой стабильности. Это очень
The
важное направление
plans
работы,
include
потому что данные – это
verification of data
ключевой это то, что необходимо как для регулятора, так и для частного сектора. Для оценки влияния климатических рисков на банковский сектор и разработки эффективных практик при Базельском комитете по банковскому надзору в 2019 году была образована рабочая группа по климатическим рискам. Среди ее задач разработка эффективных надзорных практик в целях снижения климатических финансовых рисков. Работу ведет также и Международная ассоциация органов страхового надзора. Они смотрят на механизмы учета климатических рисков в системе управления рисками в страховом секторе. В октябре этого года был опубликован консультативный доклад по надзору за учетом климатических рисков в страховом секторе. А буквально 2 недели назад документ о собственной экологической политике Международной ассоциации. Он был разработан с целью мониторинга и повышения. Вы отключили звук?
Нет,
Нет.
вас слышно в голове.
Просто у меня был выключен звук, да. Собственно, в чем должна заключаться роль регулятора? Да, вот хочу сделать мостик. В чем роль Центрального банка, в чем роль регулятора финансового сектора? Если мы говорим про управление системными рисками, то это, во-первых, выявление и оценка их влияния. Область, в которой регуляторы могут сделать и должны делать основной вклад, это понимание макрофинансовых последствий климатических рисков. И ключевым компонентом, как я уже говорил, данной работы является стресс-тестирование. Во-вторых, одним из инструментов, как вот вы затрагивали тоже в своих выступлениях, является коммуникационная политика. Стимулирование дискуссий о климатических рисках, их влиянии на финансовый сектор – это важная задача регулятора. Также важнейшее значение имеет заполнение пробелов в данных. Только при наличии точных и достаточно стандартизированных сведений о климатических рисках финансовой отчетности инвесторы, да и регуляторы смогут качественно оценивать подверженность тех или иных компаний рискам, которые связаны с изменением климата. Кроме того, в целом важна стандартизация понятийного аппарата, выработка таксономии, что также является задачей как международного сообщества регуляторов, так и регуляторов на национальном уровне. Да.
Sorry for interrupting. Could you switch to another channel because our English-speaking participants do not hear you well?
У меня он стоит off.
Interpretation should be off.
Да.
It is off, actually.
Изначально так было.
Yeah, that's how it was set up in the first place.
Видимо, проблема на стороне переводчиков, да? Хорошо. Да.
Okay, Maxim, you can
Вот.
continue.
Наконец, собственно, финальная и ключевая задача регулятора – это предотвращение накопления рисков на микро- и макроуровне. И опираясь на результаты предыдущих направлений работы, регулятор должен ответить на фундаментальный вопрос: как адекватно учитывать влияние климатических рисков в регулировании финансового сектора. Соответствующим образом необходимо перенастроить регулирование и надзор. И надо сказать, что это направление работы в мире находится на самой ранней стадии. Что касается Банка России, я скажу, что у нас есть два ключевых направления работы, определенных нашими задачами, определенных законом. Первое – это работа по развитию рынка зеленого финансирования, проводимая совместно с правительством. Второе направление, которое мы как раз сегодня обсуждаем, это управление климатическими рисками. И для координации этой работы и выработки конкретных решений в Банке России создана внутренняя рабочая группа, которая обсуждает как вопросы развития рынка, так и управления рисками, и интеграции их в надзор в дальнейшем, да, адекватный учет рисков. А на текущем этапе наши усилия сфокусированы на анализе системных рисков, связанных с климатическими изменениями, рыночными и регулятивными тенденциями в мире, учету этих факторов стресс-тестирования в коммуникации нашего видения. Как я уже говорил, мы активно взаимодействуем с нашими зарубежными коллегами на различных площадках, проводим встречи с представителями финансовых институтов. Буквально неделю назад мы проводили большую встречу с Банком Франции, поскольку они являются пионерами как в IGFS, так и в разработке и использовании сценариев климатического стресс-тестирования. Очень подробно обсуждали их опыт, обсуждали, как можно интегрировать сценарии в наше стресс-тестирование. Нашу озабоченность потенциальным влиянием климатических рисков мы коммуницировали в наших публикациях. В обзоре финансовой стабильности, это была тематическая врезка год назад, а также выделили климатический риск как потенциальный новый системный риск в обзоре финансовой стабильности, который был опубликован в конце ноября. Также мы обсуждаем каналы распространения климатических рисков. Летом этого года также был опубликован консультативный доклад о перспективах учета и мониторинга климатических рисков в деятельности российских финансовых организаций. Риски для российского рынка могут быть связаны как, собственно, с изменением климата, так и с политикой инвесторов или правительств зарубежных в этой связи. Например, введение углеродного налога в зарубежных странах. Так, для России значимыми являются планы по введению в ЕС углеродного налога, который повлечет за собой дополнительные издержки для российских компаний-экспортеров по целому ряду отраслей. Это, соответственно, может негативно сказаться на их финансовых показателях, поэтому мы оцениваем возможное влияние на банковский сектор. Что касается учета климатических рисков в регулировании и надзоре, мы активно работаем в этом направлении. Однако на текущий момент установить регуляторные требования к учету климатических рисков представляется затруднительным. Во-первых, это связано с неопределенностью будущих сценариев и с тем, как изменение климата повлияет на российскую экономику. Это как раз первый трек работы, который мы тоже ведем, и его результаты дальше лягут в основу. Также существуют проблемы с наличием и качеством данных, отсутствием единых подходов методологических для единого аппарата. Именно эти задачи мы планируем в ближайшее время последовательно и постепенно решать. Спасибо большое.
Thank you so much. That was a very interesting report, very interesting review. For the first time, we see, this global and very deep analysis that pertains to all the regulators, talking about the positions, the standpoints of the regulators. I'd like to ask a question that might be a little bit challenging, but I have to do it. There was a lot of things said about the risks, the management of the risks, their assessment, the stress tests, and supporting the financial stability. There is an understanding, maybe it is the right one, maybe not. There is an understanding that the Central Bank of Russia and the central banks of other countries, they are more responding to the potential risks with the motivation of supporting financial stability. However, we know that there is a proactive work in terms of the climate agenda and in terms of improving the approaches to ensuring the sustainability of businesses and ESG. Maybe a few words about that, because right now, at least I have a feeling that there is this kind of a exercise to, as we say in Russia, to hold the blades. We digitize the risks, we put the stats for them, then we make the recommendations and instructions to the investment community and the issuers. But that's one part of work. But the second part of work is that the regulators are giving their recommendations. They're very active in working in this area.
Да, конечно, я в выступлении затронул, что одним из важных направлений работы, один трек — это содействие развитию рынка зеленого финансирования, разработка стандартов. Уже ряд стандартов у нас был опубликован коллегами, в части раскрытия информации. И этот трек тоже продолжается. Здесь мы активно работаем с Минэкономразвития и в правительстве в целом. Но просто поскольку
But
все-таки тема была про управление
since
рисками, я
it was
сфокусировался
the
именно
topic
на
was
этом. И
management of the risks, this is
задача,
what I focused on.
задача,
Yeah,
да,
that was the right
особенность
thing to
Банка
do.
России заключается в
Yeah,
том,
but
что
the
Банк
Bank
России
of
является
Russia,
мегарегулятором,
it's a mega
и у него
regulator, that's the
совмещен
saying.
целый ряд задач.
It's
Да?
peculiar
Одна
character.
задача–
It
это
has
поддержание
many
системной
multiple tasks.
стабильности, то, о чем
One task is
говорил
to
я.
support
Есть задачи
financial
по
stability,
развитию
something
рынков,
I talked
и
about.
есть задачи
There is
по
a task
регулированию,
to
надзору за
develop the market,
секторами
and there is
финансового рынка.
a task
И как раз
to
мы вот
control and
все эти
oversee
по всем
different
направлениям
sectors of
работы
the
Банк России
financial market,
двигается
and
для
the
того,
Bank of
чтобы был
Russia is moving across
взвешенный
all these
и адекватный
streams
подход
to
как
make
к
sure that
развитию
there is
рынка,
an
так
adequate and
и
balanced approach
чтобы в
to the
рамках
development of the
стимулирования
market.
развития мы не
And as
упустили
we
системные риски.
stimulate the development of the markets, we shouldn't ignore the system-wide risks. Thank you so much. I think maybe if there are additional questions, we will discuss them during the Q&A session. Continuing with the risks, since we're talking about the risks, it's interesting to see how the provider of services and guarantees will work on that. Mark Smith will have the floor, the operations director of the Lloyd's company. Mark, what do you think? What are the challenges and the opportunities related to climate risks? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Elena. And first of all, thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak at your event, the Russian chapter event. So we're proud that Deloitte's got a global role in Chapter 0, and we're proud to be the intellectual partner for the Russian chapter. It was interesting, Elena, in your opening remarks, you said thank you to 2020. I'm not sure many of us will be saying thank you to 2020 after a difficult year, but it has prompted more change, more focus, and more attention to the things that are important going forward. One of those is obviously climate change and sustainability, and the need to make some radical steps to move things forward. Obviously, the central banks and the regulators around the world have normally looked at credit risk, liquidity risk, market risk, operational risk, and so on. But as Maxime said, climate risk has not explicitly been identified to date, and there are no clear guidelines on what to expect and what the demands are. So today I'll just touch briefly on the role of central banks and financial institutions in climate disclosures. Both you and Maxime have actually said a lot of what I wanted to say in that, so I'll be brief on that. The second area is on the business framework for climate risk management. And then lastly, we'll talk about the role of the auditor. So I'm an auditor by background. So the role of the auditor and assurance providers in climate reporting. Next slide, please. So as you heard, can we move on to the next slide? Ah, we're there. Thank you. So alarmed by the potential destabilizing effect of the climate emergency, there's been a number of financial players and supervisory bodies that have been established. We mentioned the French Prudential Supervision and Resolution Authority earlier, and also the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS. And it's on the NGFS that I just wanted to say a few words. The role of the NGFS was essentially to enhance the role of the financial system to manage risks and mobilize capital for green and also low carbon investments, and to define the best practices to be implemented. So in doing that, they established 5 main work streams, some of which Maxime has actually already spoken about. So the microprudential supervision, the microfinancial stability, the scaling of green finance, bridging the data gaps, because there are massive gaps in the data that's available to many institutions, and finally research. So looking specifically at microprudential supervision, the key is to integrate climate risk into the microprudential supervision task of the central bank, and how they do that is currently under debate. How they differentiate financial risk between green and other assets is something that needs to be documented, analysed, and a framework produced, because right now there is no consistent framework across the world, and that's part of the task of the NGFS, to establish a standardized system. The second area is that I wanted just to touch upon is microfinancial. So the climate scenarios for central banks, the stress testing, and integrating climate risk into their macroeconomic stability surveillance, what they do on an annual basis to ensure that climate risk is taken into consideration. So obviously with this going on, a number of the regulators, including the European Banking Authority, the Prudential Regulation Authority in the UK, have started to look at implementing regulation and having a need or understanding the need to integrate climate change into the risk identification process. And they've started to encourage banks to manage these same risk factors. Financial players around the world anticipate medium-term regulatory restrictions. And for banking institutions, this would mean developing a further layer of scenario-based climate risk analysis methodology for their credit portfolios. So looking at this in detail, what are the benefits of climate-related disclosures for banks? First of all, a better understanding of loan portfolios' exposure to climate-related risks. So understanding their borrowers' businesses, and what kind of impact climate-related risks could have on their overall performance. And then that links into a risk evaluation system for the calculation of capital changes and charges. So obviously, as your borrowers' books of business change, there could be impacts on the capital structure that is required to support that business. It would also encourage more informed investment and lending decisions by the financial institutions, improved attractiveness to climate-aware clients. Evidence of expertise in climate-related transactions could lead to further business opportunities. There's a number of funds around the world that only invest in climate-neutral, carbon-neutral businesses, and that business and that area of financing is continuing to develop. And then finally, evidence of risk control for financial regulators. So going back to the point of stress testing. So overall, throughout the world, some institutions have already tried to integrate climate exposures through environmental risk analysis. The problem is that integration into decision-making really remains limited. There's a lack of publicly available methodologies. There's virtually no incentives in doing so. And it's unclear what the regulatory expectations are. So with that in mind, what is actually being done? Next slide, please. So what's been developed already? I think we've gone one slide too far, so can we go back one? Yeah, thanks. So what's been done already? The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, issued a report in 2017 on attempting to address the impact of physical and transition risks and the opportunities in business of financial disclosure. They commented that financial markets need clear, comprehensive, high-quality information on the impacts of climate change. Investors, lenders, insurers don't know right now which companies will endure, which companies will suffer, and which companies will flourish as the environment changes, regulations evolve, technologies emerge, and most importantly, consumer benefits and behaviors shift. So without reliable climate change financial information, it's very difficult to price in climate-related risk for the long term. So when they developed their overall strategy and overall disclosure strategy, they looked at 4 core elements structured around how these companies operate. So these are listed below. So the governance, the strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And then looking at how we embed the consideration of climate into the business. So looking at the structure one by one. So governance. Obviously, governance is of utmost importance for any organization, financial institutions, regulated entities, and so on in particular. And it's key that the climate discussion, the climate risk analysis is taken seriously and is positioned as the responsibility of the board and role of any committees. So many companies that we see now are establishing sustainability and climate related committees alongside remuneration committees, audit committees, and so on. And so that highlights the importance of climate in the overall governance structure. It's important that they have expertise at a board level. We're starting to actually see a lot more requests for individuals as non-executive directors who have either climate, sustainability, ESG ratings experience at board levels, not only in Western markets, but also here in the CIS. So I have actually personally received a number of requests from my clients to assist in finding non-executive directors who have the relevant expertise to drive this agenda forward, because quite frankly, a lot of the board members are unaware or do not have experience in climate-related and sustainability-related risks. And then also the integrity of reporting. So it's very easy to say what's being done, but it's important to say that and be able to support it with communication, with statistics, with data. And that's something that the governance structure needs to ensure happens. Looking down through the strategy, it's important that the board's assessment of the impact of the climate on the company's business is built into the strategy. So right now, many companies neglect the impact that that has in the strategy. So for example, if the company is looking to obtain finance, what would be the impact of having an ESG rating? What would be the impact of offering their capital or debt to more financially engaged companies in terms of climate risk and sustainability risk? Quite often there are substantial yield savings or pricing advantages in doing so. So it's important that the whole climate risk agenda is built into the strategy. The resilience of the business model. So we're in the CIS right now. A lot of the businesses and the business models are based on fossil fuels and extractive industries. How resilient are those business models going forward when, as I said, consumer behaviors are shifting, regulation is increasing, availability of finance is becoming more concentrated and more vigilant of climate-related risks, and how the company is going to respond to different climate-related scenarios. Looking down at the end through the risk management department, as I said, obviously all our institutions, all of our companies that we deal with are well versed on operational risk management, liquidity risk management, credit risk management, and so on. But they haven't, in many instances, identified climate risk, physical and transition risks to this new era and this new agenda. And what is the time horizon for this? So is this a short-term horizon, medium-term horizon? What are they looking at 20, 30, 40 years out for the future of their businesses? And that has to be built into the risk management decision-making process. And as I said, integration of climate risk into the company's existing risk management systems and processes is of the utmost importance. And then finally, the metrics and the targets. So how do you measure this? How do you ensure that this is being adopted? How do you ensure that this is being taken seriously? It's key that the organizations establish metrics and targets, they publicly announce what those metrics and targets are, and they adopt clear methodologies that are consistent with their strategic commitments. The integration of those metrics into day-to-day business management and reporting is essential for people to take it on board, take it seriously. 20 years ago, one of the big points of KPIs was on health and safety at work, particularly in the extractive industries, to ensure there were no accidents, zero tolerance to accidents. Fast forward 20 years, 30 years to today, we're now looking at climate change being the new area of development and the new area of targeting KPIs. So are we going to have companies focusing on zero net emissions, and how are they going to communicate and how are they going to measure the progress against those goals? And then lastly, ensuring controls, oversight and assurance of data to making sure the data is robust enough. So there's a number of risks that fall into this throughout governance strategy, risk management, metrics and targets. There's policy and legal risks. Will the legislation that the company operates change? There's technology risks. Will some of the technology that the companies use on a day-to-day basis become defunct? Will it need to be replaced by cleaner and more climate-friendly technology? Market risks, as I said, in terms of availability of finance. And then finally, reputational risks. There's a large push for green finance, and I think Asel is going to talk about it a little bit later about green finance at the IFC, but there's a big push from many investors reputationally to ensure that they invest in climate neutral or climate aware companies. And with that come opportunities. So resource efficiency, products and services, can they move into new products and services, markets and resilience to what's happening. And all these things do have an impact on the financial statements and the financial performance of an organization, particularly on the capital and financing side. So governance, strategy, risk management, metrics and targets are of the utmost importance. The problem is now, how do we measure that and how do we ensure consistency across multiple institutions, companies, and regulators? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thanks. So one example I'm just going to touch upon very briefly is Goal 13, and Goal 13 relates to the climate initiative, managing the transition to low carbon, resilient, and valuable future with the UN. The impact platform that's been developed has been a partnership between CBI, Deloitte, the Russian chapter, Chapter Zero in the UK and Italy, Dell and the Met Office, and it's to strengthen the support for companies transitioning into a low carbon future and encouraging commitment and action. So there's some key findings here on the slide, but I'm not going to go into them in detail. What I propose is we move on to the next slide and talk more about how we move things forward. So next slide, please. Thanks. So as I said, this methodology by the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosures has broadly, I wouldn't say been completed and developed, but has been considered and widely considered. And there is clear guidance on how it should be integrated into the organization. What is missing now is a standardized set of climate-related financial disclosures. So we work on a daily basis at Deloitte in the audit department with international financial reporting standards, international accounting standards, and many of those which I've listed on the left-hand side have a linkage to climate matters. So for example, the useful life of assets, how long will an asset remain? Going back to the point I made on technology, will those become obsolete as a result of changing regulation or technological advancements? Provisions, contingencies, and onerous contracts. Will there be regulatory penalties provided against companies that do not embrace climate change and do not consider it important? So will that impact their financial consideration of their provisions and contingencies? Fair value. So how will we value assets going forward when there is a limited shelf life, there is limited future perspectives, particularly in industries that face climate challenges? And then lastly, impairment of financial assets. So are you invested into companies that are not enhancing or not including the climate agenda into their products, and what would be the impairment of those financial assets? So that's all very clear in terms of accounting standards. But what there's a push for now is reporting on the climate agenda, reporting on the governance of climate change and how you consider it, reporting on how you build it into your strategy, reporting on how you include it into your risk management decision-making processes, and then publicly declaring the metrics and targets that you trying to achieve, and how you're measuring against those benchmarks, and potentially benchmarking against other companies, organizations, or institutions within the same industry. So a number of asset managers in particular, including BlackRock, which is one of the world's largest asset managers, have pushed very heavily for standardization of climate-related disclosures. So standardization in the same way that companies report under IFRS or international accounting standards, they would report around a standardized set of climate-related disclosures. And then on top of that, to get those assured and audited. So this is where Deloitte comes in. As an auditor of a company, we would no longer look solely at the financial results of a company, the balance sheet, the income statement, and the financial statements. We would also look in conjunction with those at the climate-related disclosures and provide some form of audit or assurance on those statements. And it's only with that standardization that asset managers such as BlackRock believe that they can truly understand how companies peer against their competition in relation to embracing climate change and making steps to improve climate change. And as I said, that really goes down to the whole point of access of capital. So without that standardization, without that assurance on those disclosures, there'll be no ability for companies who are investment companies, so asset managers and so on, to be able to select on a reasonable and educated basis what companies are truly embracing climate change as an issue and managing and integrating it into their risk processes. So the benefits for the companies in general, and this is where we see true upside for individual institutions and companies, are better access to capital, increased awareness in the market, and proactively addressing investor demand. So that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is quite often, as we have seen around our region, it often takes a regulator to start to push companies in the right direction. And from listening to Maxime earlier on, it's clear that the Central Bank of Russia, as an example, clearly has climate change on its agenda. And I can only hope that the Central Bank of Russia and other central banks around the region continue to act to push climate change forward so that we can embrace and have this standardization going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for such an interesting and comprehensive overview of international standards in climate management, and thank you for specific tips and recommendations for companies and banks as to what should be in their focus of attention when they assess climate risks. It was very interesting, and at every event of ours we always touch upon this, but we still find new things. I have a couple of questions for you, but I think I will ask them at the end of our discussion because I would like to give the floor to some other speakers first. And now I think it would be the right time to talk about the climate agenda and in general on sustainable development and what is done about it at the biggest bank in Russia. It's not the regulator, but it's systemically important for the Russian economy, for the financial system in Russia, and it's a leader in a lot of progressive areas, including ESG. On the 11th of December, Sberbank adopted a new version of the corporate governance code where ESG is one of its focus areas. I welcome Tatiana Zavyalova, Senior Vice President of Sberbank. Tatiana, could you talk some more about the plans and action taken by Sberbank in that area of ESG? Hello, colleagues. I'm very happy to see all the participants who joined us to share information and experience on such an important, not that new, but dynamically developing topic of ESG. It's a huge topic indeed. And I agree with Olga and Mark. It's difficult to say thank you to 2020, but at the same time, this year has catalyzed a lot of processes, including those in sustainable development. Of course, today we focus on climate issues, but ESG is a much broader agenda that includes social factors as well. 2020 was a very big test of resilience of various systems and the government and companies and society at large. It was a test for them in how they can respond to dramatic changes, localized not just in one country, but happening across the globe. Issues of sustainable development have to do with what is going to happen with our world, with our society, our ecosystems, and our economic systems. Not in the near term, which we can forecast and anticipate more or less well, but in long term, in the next 30 or in 50 years. Clearly the world is changing, and 2020 showed how sudden, how unexpected these changes can be. How prepared are we and our systems to respond to such changes, not just in social areas, but also in issues related to climate? And here we know very well that climate is changing and it exerts certain pressure on governance and business. It's increasing, and we must respond accordingly. We must readjust our systems on the level of business and on the level of governments as well. And this is where it goes back to Sberbank in 2020. We have first realized for the first time that we can no longer talk about serious, proper development of our business, of our corporation, unless we start looking at our future, our business, in light of ESG factors. Therefore, 2020 for us became brand new because in 2020, in August, at our traditional regular strategic sessions, we, for the first time, approved the ESG strategy of Sber, where we declared the main principles, our main understanding, our main targets for the ESG transformation of Sber. And that process has already begun. The ESG strategy was included in the strategy of Sber, the traditional 3-year strategy. The new one was presented on the 30th of November. And the ESG approach became a sort of an end-to-end element of our new strategy for the next 3 years. Clearly, ESG factors are difficult to limit with those short periods of time, but it's just the beginning for us. In these 3 years, we're planning to make our first steps, and we understand that our future lies in ESG transformation. What is being done at Sberbank now and what are our goals? This is where I'd like to speak some more about the need for very close cooperation between businesses and the government in promoting the goals and principles of sustainable development. We've heard an excellent detailed presentation by Maxim Morozov. Where he laid out the position of the central bank, and we see that the Central Bank of Russia is very much involved in incorporating the ESG agenda in its principles of operation. Moreover, Sberbank knows about it. We've known about it not just from the presentation by Maxim. We have been working very closely with the central bank in ESG. We've had a number of big meetings. Mr. Gref, our CEO, met with the governor of the central bank, Ms. Nabiulina. And in that dialogue, we've been working together with the central bank in order to design stress tests that incorporate ESG issues across the country. We've also heard about the need for high-quality stress tests, which would describe possible effects for the economic system, for businesses, for the country at large, and which would take into consideration environmental, ecological factors and changes in legislation, in regulation, having to do with decrease in carbon footprint at the international level. So we've been engaged in that work. We will very soon present the first results. Briefly, the situation looks rather concerning. We see that the climate is changing, it's getting warmer. In Russia, it's getting warmer twice as fast, more than twice as fast as around the world. The permafrost regions are getting warmer even faster. This creates risks for our businesses, it creates infrastructure risks. If I'm not mistaken, more than 60% of the Russian territory is in the permafrost regions. So for us, these factors are more than sensitive, which we must take into account.
Moreover, the implementation of the international carbon regulation is a major problem for the Russian economy as a whole, because the pressure will be felt not only by our oil producing companies, but also other companies that work with metals and other mining industries that traditionally have a large carbon footprint will be impacted. But this is what we have to consider, and we work with the central bank. Why Sber is doing that actually? Well, it's obvious we are the largest financial institution of the country, so we can transform hypotheses into concrete figures and land them and translate them to the specific companies and make forecasts for the entire industries, and we are able to then understand what will be the ramifications for the economy in general. Now, that's what we do. What is our mutual agenda? That has to be addressed by the businesses and inevitably by the state. We have to move towards each other. The businesses have to provide information and suggestions to make sure that the state can create new tools and levers that would make the transformations of the businesses reasonable, economically reasonable, based on the ESG and sustainable development factors. Actually, these principles and suggestions, we have voiced them on the Russian Climate Conference that was held on the 1st up till the 3rd December. We hope that this discussion will be continued. We're having this discussion on the level of the central bank and the government, and we hope that together we'll be able to find the best solution. So what are the mechanisms that would support these changes on the level of the economy, on the level of accessibility to funding and more active engagement in terms of refine-tuning the systems and the companies based on ESG factors? The funds that encourage the green investments should be encouraged, and the subsidy for the interest rates for the ESG loans, the calibration of the macro add-on with the customers with a good ESG rating, and the creation of additional provisions for the possible losses based on the ESG rating of a customer. We are talking about that. We are building our work and our discussion based on our experience of working with the customers, and we'll hope that we'll be able to implement new rules that would make an ESG transformation for the businesses more reasonable from the business point of view. And now I would like to talk about the plans and the tasks and the first outcomes of Sber efforts in ESG transformation. We call this process an ESG transformation, and there are quite major changes in terms of the corporate governance too, the changes that we have already done. I would like to thank Mark, who was very detailed in saying that without using the tools within the corporation, no ESG transformation, corporate ESG transformation is possible. So we have started with adjusting our corporate governance system. So first of all, we of course implemented ESG competencies and skills on the level of the board. On the level of the supervisory board, let's start with the highest level, the level of the top management board, executive board, and our corporate governance has now ESG tools and ESG agenda. For example, every week we hold an ESG committee where we discuss all projects, including federal and regional initiatives in ESG, and we also discuss the required system-wide changes that has to come through within the corporation to make sure that the ESG transformation is implemented. Starting from the next year, and it's very important, we implemented ESG indicators in the KPI system. We have ESG goals formulated for our business and functional blocks that would necessitate them to transform, driven by our ESG goals that we have set, at least for the year ahead. Can I have the next slide? Yep, this one. So I'm going to talk in more detail about the specific projects that SBIR is engaged in, and these are the ESG projects. Let's start with the environmental protection. So to get together with the participants in the market, we developed the legal base to classify ESG risks and assess the ecological footprint. It is understandable that the banks do not produce a lot of carbon footprint, but we have diverse customers, and the number of customers have a significant carbon footprint. And now we're working on creating the mechanisms that would encourage the customers to be responsible and to minimize their footprint on their side. So this is one of our key priorities. We are also, can I have the next slide, please? We try to minimize, oh no, sorry, can you go back, please? Yeah, I'm going to talk about our environmental protection efforts. Despite the fact that, as I've said before, the SBIR footprint is not that significant, we put an ambitious task to drive down our own negative impact on the environment, and we launch large-scale projects and programs that would make our activities greener. We have a task to decrease the document flow, paper document flow. Every year we decrease it by 30% at least. By 2023, we want to increase the amount and volume of recycled waste to 40%. By 2023, we plan to increase the procurement volume of the green energy that is supplied to our offices to up to 30%. These are the plans. Next year, we plan to calculate our own carbon footprint, and we plan to then drive it down. Another important goal, environmental protection goal, and the goal to minimize our footprint and impact on the national level is the system of responsible procurement. 100% of all our procurement should meet ESG criteria. That's what we plan to do. You understand that SBIR is a huge organization. We have one of the most significant platforms for procurement. We have a myriad of partners across Russia. So all of the procurements should be made based on ESG criteria, and that will generate new practices and would promote these new procurement practices based on ESG within the country. And we hope that in the next 3 years, we'll be able to achieve this goal. I should say that one of the key tasks is to form the federal level excellence center in ESG, including ESG financing, not only financing, but ESG businesses, doing business based on ESG. We're not only resolving financial tasks, addressing financial needs of our retail and corporate customers, but we also deliver the solutions for their various needs and their various types of activity. And it is obvious that our access to the retail and corporate customers should be as convenient as possible. So promoting ESG culture in the businesses and for the retail customers using the Sber platform is, we think, one of the most efficient tools that we can use to this end. Next slide, please. Despite the fact that today we're talking about the climate, sustainable development is not only about climate, it's also about social agenda. And for Sber, the focus on social tasks has always been one of the key ones, and the reasons are clear. We have an ambitious agenda here too, and we already can share some achievements. Just a few words about our achievements in creating level playing fields for all of our customers. So I'm talking first of all about the inclusive solutions that Sber has been creating. We are forming the practices of inclusive solutions, first of all for the banking sector, and Sber promotes it actively to the market. I think we have one of the best projects here in Russia, that's for sure. Maybe not only in Russia, but it also relates to the providing access to visually impaired people and customers. We're talking about addressing their needs in the financial sector. One of the new solutions that we implemented in 2020, we have implemented an online service to find a job for disabled people. It is a challenge, and the pandemic only exacerbated that. Therefore, it was very important for us to organize, to provide such a possibility. We promote the industry standards for the people with disabilities, and the central bank is supporting us here actively, so I would like to thank the colleagues for that. And we also actively support volunteers. Next slide, please. And despite the fact that I'm on the slide that talks about corporate governance, I would like to say a few more words about the social efforts that we have addressed this year. Especially, it was relevant, against the backdrop of the pandemic. We have implemented a number of projects in healthcare to make the access to the healthcare services easier for the Russian citizens, and it was very important this year, and we hope that by the end of the pandemic, this focus will remain. And another very important task is education. We are all, in this way or another, go through a very challenging project. The education, at least education for kids, go online, forgo in the traditional methods, and it's a very challenging process, and Sberbank has its own solutions. We have our own educational platform that we have implemented in many schools across Russia, and this platform can make this transition more seamless without losing the quality, and maybe it will actually add some new level of quality to this whole educational process. Now, a few words about how we change our corporate governance system. I have already mentioned that we try to implement ESG agenda on all management and governance layers of Sberbank, but we're also actively engaging in global international initiatives in ESG. United Nations Environmental Program, for instance, the principles of the responsible banking activity, also the global United Nations Development Program. We're actually working with the World Economic Fund forum in Davos, where for them ESG is on top of their agenda. And concluded with this section, I'd like to say that for us, ESG transformation is also, you know, from the position of our core business, from the perspective of our core business, the implementation of ESG factors in risk assessment is something that we are actively involved in, and in our credit policy, we have already decreased the loans to the customers with the unacceptably high level of ESG risk. We're working on improving the stress testing system based on the ESG factors, and by 2023, we plan to implement ESG scoring for our entire credit portfolio. This is maybe where I would like to end, talking about our showcases. I could have talked about that for longer, but that's details really. I would like to end with the thought, with the message that the successful ESG transformation of a corporation or a business system on a national level is only possible with the active and engaged cooperation between the state, the regulator, and the business. And obviously we have to, I do agree with Maxim, we have to formulate, to work out the common rules and understanding on what is ESG, how do we measure it, how do we describe it, how do we assess it, and how we apply it. And that should be done on the national level. And here the regulator and the state are unlikely to find the best solutions if they do not engage large and medium businesses, because we from our side should also suggest solutions and developing metric system, and Sber is totally ready to assist. And actually we see ourselves as the very large scale platform to develop ESG methodologies, metrics, and rules that are needed for the transformation of the country and the businesses in ESG in the nearest future. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that. You know, I'm really surprised and shocked by the scale of the efforts that you engage in. I'd like to thank you. Thank you so much for that work. Thank you. I'd like to thank Sber, because, well, basically, you know, you have a risk of becoming a leader in this area in the country. I am very happy that we are partners here, and it's great that you have some very specific recommendations and some specific efforts that you actually do. You know, the KPIs, the weekly meetings, you know, I think it's really great. Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we're behind the schedule a little bit. We have a few questions, but maybe they should be discussed during our Q&A session. Arsen Rasmetova going to Kazakhstan now, the advisor of the International Financial Astana Center. We're going to talk about the Make It Kazakhstan Greener. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon to participants. It's a pleasure for me to speak after such great participants and speakers representing Sberbank and Deloitte. The Green Finance Center, I think, combines the focus areas that the previous speakers talked about. So I will tell you more about the green finance development and the main landmarks in that area. As Mark said in his presentation, he talked about investor push, this initiative of investors, where investors all around the world are laying a lot of emphasis on green investment. And thanks to that investor push, here in Kazakhstan, we've decided to develop green finance on the platform of AIFC. Involving the central bank, the Financial Regulation Center, and the Agency for Regulating Financial Services. As AIFC was created in 2016, it was decided to develop and implement new solutions on a platform where it would be faster and easier thanks to English law, international expertise. Back then, we also signed a memorandum with the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development. They helped us to make this first step toward green finance. This resulted in creating the Kazakhstan green finance ecosystem, which also transformed into a strategy, green finance strategy until 2018. We formulated the rules for issuing green bonds based on the international market principles and the Climate Bond Initiative standards. We've also conducted the first forum of green development, and we created an award for green finance achievements. The Green Finance Council included distinguished international experts in that area. Dr. Madzun, the former advisor to the Central Bank of China. He's currently the chairman of a number of committees on green finance development in many countries. Also on our council, we have a representative from the Great Britain regulator. In 2019, we proposed an amendment to the national legislation to establish green finance principles in the national legislation. Next slide, please. I'm going to tell you some more about the achievements this year, but before I do, I just wanted to say that the Green Finance Center is a subsidiary of the Astana International Financial Center. We had the Eurasian Development Bank join us as a shareholder. One of the main areas of activities for our center are supporting the issuance of green and social bonds, providing external overviews for green bonds, and developing potential in green and social finance, conducting seminars, training, and also consulting services. Next slide, please. Given the low maturity of the green finance market in Kazakhstan, we are also promoting, encouraging the development of green finance in the country. So we have been engaged in developing innovative solutions. We provide business and strategic consulting in green and social financing, and we also provide comprehensive support to issuers of social and green bonds. Also this year, we've launched a program for refunding the expenses of green bond issuers for the external overview, which is a mandatory document for the stock exchange. Also, through our partners, we have made the services of legal and financial consultants cheaper, acting under our international memoranda and agreements. On this slide, you can see our partnership network, including countries, different countries around the world, central banks, financial centers, united in this idea of sustainable financing, United Nations platforms and initiatives, and many more. Next slide, please. I've already slightly mentioned our achievements in 2020. We have launched the market of green bonds, and green finance is now established, incorporated in the environmental legislation in the country. Also, that includes building a pipeline for green projects and finding an issuer who would be fully in line with the IFC exchange rules and regulations. We have prepared an external overview for the first issue. For the market of green bonds, the first issue took place in March this year. For us, it's of symbolic value because it's a pilot project. With regard to legislation, for the first time, green finance was established on the legislative level in Kazakhstan. We introduced the definition of green finance, green taxonomy, green projects, green bonds, green loans in the legislation to further action, further economic stimulation of these financial instruments. Going forward, it will allow us to develop and establish on the level of the Republic the green taxonomy, the unified classification of green projects, because there is a need for that, a need for alignment with international standards and some national needs and requirements and specifics in the country. Next slide, please. Here I wanted to say a couple of words on the support that we provide as a development institution with regard to bond issuance. We can help our customers and our issuers to find investors. Our stock exchange has around 30 listed companies that have a certain pool of investors, not just in Kazakhstan, but also in Russia, in China, in Great Britain, and other countries. So there is a possibility to engage investors to green or social projects. Also, as I said, we compensate part of the expenditure of issuers, including expenditure on financial and legal services. We can also help in developing the necessary documentation in green and social financing, in sustainable development, and also we provide help with external overviews. The next slide, a case, an example, in issue of green bonds. This is a typical algorithm for issuing green bonds. The issuer contacts the Green Finance Center. We provide primary consultation on the AIFC regulations, on international standards that we refer to in our rules. Then the issuer decides whether or not to issue the bonds. If yes, they select the financial consultant, they compile documentation, the bond prospectus, offer documents, or terms of conditions. So they create a set of necessary documentation for the green part of the bonds, the green framework. Then the review of that policy and the positive financial statements. As a result of the review by our stock exchange and the financial regulator, the issuer is the securities are accepted for listing. The coupon rate is 11.75%. Part of the coupon rate will be subsidized in Kazakhstan, and also one of the main characteristics, apart from that and the maturity period, the targets for issuing the bonds. In our rules for green bonds on the IFC exchange, we refer to the principle of the international principles, the 10 categories. We've also developed a draft for the green taxonomy, incorporating the national specifics. Here is our draft for the green taxonomy. It includes 8 categories, 65 subsectors. We wanted and we needed to go into greater detail about the categories. So not just broad strokes and just 9 categories. We wanted to dive deeper with the sectors and subsectors. We also include transitional sector, the low pollution sectors, transition to gas or liquid coal, or greener coal alternatives. This is the mechanism for implementation of this green taxonomy. With AIFC, we see that through issuing green bonds. So we also review those green bonds for compliance with the green taxonomy. We also look at this when borrowers come to request a green loan. This is where banks can, by themselves, verify this compliance with the taxonomy if they have the possibility. If it's a large bank, we plan to have relevant departments in large banks that will work with green projects, maybe environmental departments that would provide by themselves a confirmation stating that yes, this project for which the loan is requested is a green project, it complies with the green taxonomy. If not, a verifying authority will have to verify this compliance with the green taxonomy to obtain a green loan. In brief, I've tried to cover what we've done so far, and apart from that, next year we plan to start working on green procurement. As the colleague from USBA mentioned, in our plans, the implementation of green procurement processes on the national level. But first, we would like to test the system at the AIFS, at the AIC, and then roll it out across the country. Since we now have this definition of green loans and green bonds in the legislation referring to the green taxonomy, we would also like to work on mechanisms for subsidizing of interest rates for green loans in particular. We hope that this system will be commissioned in the second half of 2021. Thank you very much for that detailed presentation on the ESG agenda in Kazakhstan and what you've been doing to support it. I'm very much impressed by the progress that you've achieved in terms of issuing green bonds. A very quick question. The National Bank of Kazakhstan, is it going to become a member of the GFS? Yes, we've been in dialogue with the National Bank and the financial agency and the Agency for Financial Market Regulation. They have a very, very positive outlook on green legislation, and we very much expect them to join our initiative. And also the Financial Regulation Agency has that in their plans. They may join it as well. Thank you very much. Very interesting presentations. Unfortunately, due to time constraints, I'm afraid we won't have enough time for a Q&A session. We have a couple of questions in the chat. We're going to address all of them after the round table. We'll answer them offline, all of them. Happy New Year. Have the best of luck in 2021. Thank you very much for your participation. We're looking forward to seeing you back at our events. Thank you and bye-bye.